What had made the planes break in the first place? Some kind of great weight? The music was coming from the plains. Hesitant, yet unable to resist, he walked forward, eastward onto the flat, wind-swept rock. As he grew close, Kaladin smelled smoke. A light burned out there, a tiny campfire. Kaladin walked out to the edge of this particular peninsula, a chasm growing from the cracks until it plunged down into darkness. At the very tip of the peninsula, surrounded on three sides by chasm, Kaladin found a man sitting on a boulder, wearing a light-eyes black uniform. A small fire of rockbud shell burned in front of him. The man's hair was short and black, his face angular. He wore a thin, black-sheathed sword at his waist. The man's eyes were a pale blue. Kaladin had never heard of a light-eyed man playing a flute.
I thought they considered music a feminine pursuit. Light-eyed men sing, but they don't play instruments unless they're artists.
Kaladin stopped a short distance away, realizing that the last thing he wanted to do now was deal with a Bright Lord, particularly one who was eccentric enough to dress in black and wander out onto the shattered plains to practice his flute. Kaladin turned to go.
I always worry that I'll forget how to play her. It's silly, I know, considering how long I've practiced. But these days, I rarely give her the attention she deserves.
Kaladin turned toward the stranger. His flute was carved from a dark wood that was almost black. The instrument seemed too ordinary to belong to a light-eyes, yet the man held it reverently.
What are you doing here?
Sitting, occasionally playing.
I mean, why are you here?
Why am I here? Why are any of us here? That's a rather deep question for a first meeting, young bridgeman. I generally prefer introductions before theology. Lunch, too, if it can be found. Perhaps a nice nap. Actually, practically anything should come before theology, but especially introductions.
All right. And you are?
Sitting, occasionally playing, with the minds of bridgemen.
Kaladin reddened, turning again to go.
Well, off with you then. Glad you are going. Wouldn't want you too close. I'm rather attached to my Stormlight.
Kaladin froze, then he spun.
What?
My spheres. Everyone knows that bridgemen are thieves, or at least beggars.
Of course. He's talking about spheres. He doesn't know about my affliction, does he?
The man's eyes twinkled as if at a grand joke.
Don't be insulted at being called a thief.
Kaladin frowned.
Where did the sphere go?
He had been holding it in that hand.
I meant it as a compliment.
A compliment? Calling someone a thief?
Of course. I myself am a thief.
You are? What do you steal?
Pride, and occasionally boredom, if I may take the pride unto myself. I am the king's wit, or I was until recently. I think I shall probably lose the title soon.
The king's what?
Wit. It was my job to be witty.
Saying confusing things isn't the same as being witty.
Ah, already you prove yourself more wise than most who have been my acquaintance lately. What is it to be witty, then?
To say clever things.
And what is cleverness?
I guess it's the ability to say and do the right things at the right time.
The king's wit cocked his head, then smiled. Finally, he held out his hand to Kaladin.
And what is your name, my thoughtful bridgeman?
Kaladin hesitantly raised his own hand.
Kaladin. And yours?
I've many. I began life as a thought, a concept, words on a page. That was another thing I stole, myself. Another time I was named for a rock.
A pretty one, I hope.
A beautiful one, and one that became completely worthless for my wearing it.
Well, what do men call you now?
Many a thing, and only some of them polite. Almost all are true, unfortunately. You, however, may call me Hoid.
Your name?
No, the name of someone I should have loved. Once again, this is a thing I stole. It is something we thieves do.
Wit glanced eastward over the rapidly darkening plains. The little fire burning beside Hoid's boulder shed a fugitive light, red from glimmering coals.
Well, it was pleasant to meet you. I'll be on my way.
Not before I give you something. Wait, please.
Kaladin had a feeling that this odd man was not going to let him escape until he was done.
This is a trailman's flute. It is meant to be used by a storyteller, for him to play while he is telling a story.
You mean to accompany a storyteller? being played by someone else while he speaks.
Actually, I meant what I said.
How would a man tell a story while playing the flute?
Hoid raised an eyebrow, then lifted the flute to his lips. He played it differently from flutes Kaladin had seen. Instead of holding it down in front of him, Hoid held it out to the side and blew across its top.
This story is about Derethil and the Wandersail.
Kaladin found himself transfixed. The tune was powerful, almost demanding, as if each note were a hook flung out to spear Kaladin's flesh and hold him near.
Derethil is well known in some lands, though I have heard him spoken of less here in the East. He was a king during the Shadow Days, the time before memory, a powerful man, commander of thousands, leader of tens of thousands, tall, regal, blessed with fair skin and fairer eyes. He was a man to envy.
As Hoid played, eyes closed, he leaned forward toward the fire. The air he blew over the flute churned the smoke, stirring it. The smoke swirled, and Kaladin thought he could make out the face of a man in the patterns of smoke, a man with a pointed chin and lofty cheekbones. It wasn't really there, of course, just imagination. But the haunting song and the swirling smoke seemed to encourage his imagination.
Derethil fought the Voidbringers during the days of the Heralds and Radiance. When there was finally peace, he found he was not content. His eyes always turned westward, toward the great open sea. He commissioned the finest ship men had ever known, a majestic vessel intended to do what none had dared before, sail the seas during a high storm.
The smoke swirled, rising in the air, twisting in the wind of Hoid's breath. And Kaladin almost thought he could see an enormous ship in a shipyard, with a sail as large as a building, secured to an arrow-like hull.
Derethil's goal was to seek the origin of the Voidbringers, the place where they had been spawned. Many called him a fool, yet he could not hold himself back. He named the vessel the Wandersail, and gathered a crew of the bravest of sailors. Then, on a day when a high storm brewed, this ship cast off. Riding out into the ocean, the sail hung wide, like arms open to the storm winds.
Which stirred the fire by kicking at a piece of rockbud shell. Sparks of flame rose in the air and smoke puffed, swirling as Hoid rotated his head down and pointed the flute's holes at the smoke. And Kaladin saw it in his mind's eye. The massive ship suddenly minuscule before the awesome power of a high storm. Blown, carried out into the endless sea. What had this Derethil hoped or expected to find? A high storm on land was terrible enough, but on the sea? Kaladin found himself sinking down to the rocks, watching the swirling smoke and rising flames, seeing the tiny ship captured and held within a furious maelstrom.
The Wandersail was nearly destroyed in the crash, but Derethil and most of his sailors survived. They found themselves on a ring of small islands, surrounding an enormous whirlpool where, it is said, the ocean drains. Derethil and his men were greeted by a strange people with long, limber bodies who wore robes of single color and shells in their hair unlike any that grow back on Roshar. These people took the survivors in, fed them, and nursed them back to health. During his weeks of recovery, Derethil studied the strange people who called themselves the Uvara, the people of the Great Abyss. They lived curious lives. Unlike the people in Roshar, who constantly argue, the Uvara always seemed to agree. From childhood, there were no questions. Each and every person went about his duty.
Hoid let the smoke rise unhindered. Kaladin thought he could see it in a people, industrious, always working. A building rose among them with a figure at the window. Derethil, watching.
One day, while Derethil and his men were sparring to regain strength, a young serving girl brought them refreshment. She tripped on an uneven stone, dropping the goblets to the floor and shattering them. In a flash, the other Uvara descended upon the hapless child and slaughtered her in a brutal way. Derethil and his men were so stunned that by the time they had regained their wits, the child was dead. Angry, Derethil demanded to know the cause of the unjustified murder. One of the other natives explained, "Our emperor will not suffer failure."
Kaladin witnessed the girl being bludgeoned to death with rocks and the proud form of Derethil bowing above her fallen body. Kaladin knew that sorrow, the sorrow of failure, of letting someone die when he should have been able to do something. So many people he loved had died. He had a reason for that now. He'd drawn the ire of the heralds and the Almighty.
It has to be that, doesn't it?
He knew he should be getting back to Bridge 4, but he couldn't pull himself away. He hung on the storyteller's words.
As Derethil began to pay more attention, he saw other murders. These Uvara, these people of the Great Abyss, were prone to astonishing cruelty. If one of their members did something wrong, something the slightest bit untoward or unfavorable, the others would slaughter him or her. Each time he asked, Derethil's caretaker gave him the same answer. "Our emperor will not suffer failure."
Kaladin frowned as he watched the smoke spin, making what appeared to be a tower, tall, thin, with an open structure at the top.
The emperor, Derethil discovered, resided in the tower on the eastern coast of the largest island among the Uvara. Derethil determined that he needed to confront this cruel emperor. What kind of monster would demand that such an obviously peaceful people kill so often and so terribly? Derethil gathered his sailors, a heroic group, and they armed themselves. The Uvara did not try to stop them, though they watched with fright as the strangers stormed the emperor's tower. Derethil and his men came out of the tower a short time later, carrying a desiccated corpse in fine robes and jewelry. "This is your emperor?" Derethil demanded. "We found him in the top room alone." It appeared that the man had been dead for years, but nobody had dared enter his tower. They were too frightened of him. When he showed the Uvara the dead body, they began to wail and weep. The entire island was cast into chaos as the Uvara began to burn homes, riot, or fall to their knees in torment. Amazed and confused, Derethil and his men stormed the Uvara shipyards where the Wandersail was being repaired. Their guide and caretaker joined them, and she begged to accompany them in their escape. So it was that Nafti joined the crew. Derethil and his men set sail, and though the winds were still, they rowed the Wandersail around the whirlpool, using the momentum to spin them out and away from the islands. Long after they left, they could see the smoke rising from the ostensibly peaceful lands. They gathered on the deck, watching, and Derethil asked Nafti the reason for the terrible riots.
Hoid fell silent, letting his words rise with the strange smoke, lost to the night.
Well, what was her response?
Holding a blanket around herself, staring with haunted eyes at her lands, she replied, "Do you not see, traveling one? If the emperor is dead, and has been all these years, then the murders we committed are not his responsibility. They are our own."
Kaladin sat back. Gone was the taunting, playful tone Hoid had used earlier. No more mockery, no more quick tongue intended to confuse. This story had come from within his heart, and Kaladin found he could not speak. He just sat, thinking of that island and the terrible things that had been done.
I think that is cleverness.
Hoid raised an eyebrow looking up from his flute.
Being able to remember a story like that, to tell it with such care.
Be wary of what you say. If all you need for cleverness is a good story, then I'll find myself out of a job.
Didn't you say you were already out of a job?
True. The king is finally without wit. I wonder what that makes him.
Yeah, witless?
I'll tell him you said that. But I think it's inaccurate. One can have a wit, but not a witless. What is a wit?
I don't know. Some kind of spren in your head, maybe? That makes you think?
Why, I suppose that's as good an explanation as any.
Is the story true?
Perhaps.
But how would we know it? Did Derethil and his men return?
Some stories say they did.
But how could they? The high storms only blow in one direction.
Then I guess the story is a lie.
I didn't say that.
No, I said it. Fortunately, it's the best kind of lie.
And what kind is that?
Why, the kind I tell, of course.
Hoid kicked out the fire, grinding the last of the coals beneath his heel. It didn't really seem there had been enough fuel to make the smoke Kaladin had seen.
What did you put in the fire to make that special smoke?
Nothing. It was just an ordinary fire.
But I saw...
What you saw belongs to you. A story doesn't live until it is imagined in someone's mind.
What does the story mean, then?
It means what you want it to mean. The purpose of a storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. Too often, we forget that.
Kaladin frowned, looking westward, back toward the war camps. They were alight now, with spheres, lanterns, and candles.
It means taking responsibility. The Uvara, they were happy to kill and murder, so long as they could blame the Emperor. It wasn't until they realized there was nobody to take the responsibility that they showed grief.
That's one interpretation. A fine one, actually. So, what is it you don't want to take responsibility for?
What?
People see in stories what they're looking for, my young friend.
Hoid reached behind his boulder, pulling out a pack and slinging it on his shoulder.
I have no answers for you. Most days, I feel I never have had any answers. I've come to your land to chase an old acquaintance, but I end up spending most of my time hiding from him instead.
You said about me and responsibility.
Just an idle comment, nothing more. My comments are often idle. I never can get them to do any solid work. Would that I could make my words carry stones. That would be something to see.